Rebecca Keller had turned down 11 men in a single calendar year, and the 12th was already straightening his collar on the porch steps. The town of Harlow Creek, Texas, in the spring of 1878, was not a place where a woman of 24 could afford to be too particular, or so everyone kept telling her. The frontier had a way of making people practical about love, the same way it made them practical about water and firewood and the likelihood of a hard winter. You took what you could get, and you were grateful for it, and you did not sit on your father's porch in the late afternoon light with your arms folded, and your jaw set like a woman who had read too many books and developed ideas too complicated for the territory. But Rebecca Keller had done exactly that, and she was not remotely sorry. She watched Jerome Pickard come up the front walk with his hat in both hands and that hopeful, miserable expression that men seemed to put on like a Sunday suit when they were about to make fools of themselves. Jerome was a decent man. He owned 200 acres of decent land east of town, ran a modest herd of longhorns, and had a jaw like the side of a barn. He was, by every practical measure that Harlow Creek applied to such things, a fine catch. Rebecca already knew she was going to say no. "Miss Keller," Jerome started, getting one boot on the first step before he seemed to lose his nerve entirely and stayed there, balanced between the decision and the retreat. "I've been meaning to speak with you for some time." "I know you have, Jerome," Rebecca said, and her voice was not unkind. It never was. That was what made the whole business worse for everyone involved. She did not crush men with cruelty. She refused them with a gentle certainty that somehow left them feeling worse than anger would have. "And I think you are a genuinely good man. I think you deserve someone who looks forward to seeing you walk up the path." Jerome blinked. "You don't look forward to it." "I'm sorry," she said simply. "I don't." He stood there another moment, and then he put his hat back on his head and walked away, and Rebecca watched him go with something complicated moving behind her eyes. It was not satisfaction. It was not cruelty. It was something quieter and harder to name, the particular loneliness of a person who knows exactly what she does not want and has absolutely no certainty yet about what she does. Her father, Edmund Keller, appeared in the doorway behind her. He was a broad, weathered man of 52, with a full white beard and the kind of permanent squint a person developed after spending 3 decades staring at the Texas sun. He had come out from Tennessee in 1851 with a wagon, a mule, a young wife, and a conviction that the land out west would reward a man who worked it honestly. The land had rewarded him, more or less. His wife Charlotte had died of fever 11 years back, leaving him with Rebecca at 13 and a son, Daniel, at 9. Edmund had managed everything after that with a quiet, stubborn competence that Rebecca had inherited so completely it sometimes felt like a family curse. "That was Jerome Pickard," Edmund said. "It was. He has 200 acres. He does." Edmund was quiet for a moment. He leaned against the doorframe and looked out at the yard, where the last of the afternoon light was turning the dusk golden. "Rebecca," he said, and his voice had that particular tone, not angry, not demanding, just deeply, profoundly tired. "You are 24 years old." "I'm aware of that, Papa. Women in this territory do not have the luxury of waiting forever." "I understand the concern," she said. "I do, but I would rather spend my life alone than spend it with someone I feel nothing for. That is not stubbornness. That is just arithmetic." Edmund stared at her for a long moment, and then, against his will, a ghost of something that might have been pride moved across his face before he suppressed it and went back inside. Rebecca stayed on the porch until the sun went all the way down. The news of Jerome Pickard's rejection spread through Harlow Creek with the efficiency that small towns have always reserved for humiliating information. By the following morning, everyone within 15 miles had heard that the Keller girl had turned down another suitor. The count was the subject of genuine civic fascination. Some people kept track the way they kept track of rainfall, with a mixture of awe and mild anxiety about what it meant for the season. The general store, run by a stout, cheerful woman named Mabel Good, had become the informal clearinghouse for all such intelligence. Mabel herself was an enthusiast of other people's romantic difficulties in the way that some people are enthusiasts of horse racing. She loved the competition, loved the drama, and had strong opinions about the likely outcomes. 11, Mabel said to her Tuesday morning customers, shaking her head with theatrical sorrow. 11 men. Harlow Creek, Benton's Ford, and Cleary Hollow, that's 3 counties, mind you. The Harlow Creek boys I understand. But she turned down Carson Dye from Cleary Hollow, and that man has a house with actual glass windows. Old Hattie Morse, who was 81 and had outlived 2 husbands and had opinions about everything, looked up from the bolt of calico she was examining. "The girl has standards," she said. "What is wrong with that?" "Nothing is wrong with it," Mabel said, "except that the territory runs out of eligible men eventually, and then standards don't do you much good on a cold night." Hattie gave Mabel a look that could have stripped paint from a barn door. "Charlotte Keller was the same way," she said. "Turned down every man in Franklin County before Edmund Keller showed up and didn't say a blessed word. Just took off his hat and looked at her, and she married him 4 months later. She set down the calico. The girl comes by it honestly. She's waiting for something real." Mabel digested this. "Something real," she repeated, as if testing the weight of the phrase. "Well, real is hard to come by out here." "Everything worth having is hard to come by out here," Hattie said. "That's rather the point of the whole enterprise." Rebecca herself was largely unaware of and certainly indifferent to being the subject of such conversation. She had a life to run, which was a more consuming business than most people gave her credit for. The Keller homestead was not small. Edmund managed the cattle, 43 head of mixed Longhorn stock, but Rebecca ran the household accounts, managed the kitchen garden, preserved the summer harvest, handled the correspondence with the feed supplier in San Antonio, and taught reading lessons on Tuesday and Thursday afternoons to the 4 children of their nearest neighbor, the Garza family, who had come up from Coahuila a decade ago, and were working hard to make sure their children would have every door open to them that had been closed to their parents. Maria Garza, who was 38 and had the kind of serene competence that made Rebecca feel simultaneously admired and slightly inadequate, often sat with her during those lessons and worked on her own reading. They had developed an odd and genuine friendship. The Anglo rancher's daughter and the Mexican homesteader's wife, unlikely allies in a territory that often worked hard to keep such women apart. "They say you turned down Jerome Pickard," Maria said one Thursday afternoon, while the children bent over their McGuffey readers and Rebecca refilled the ink jar. "I did," Rebecca said. "He is not a bad man. No, he is a perfectly decent man." Rebecca capped the ink jar and set it on the shelf. "Decent is not enough. I am sorry if that sounds ungrateful for what the territory offers," Maria smiled. It was the particular smile of a woman who had been deeply, specifically lucky in her own marriage, who knew exactly the difference between settling and choosing. "It does not sound ungrateful," she said. "It sounds like you know what you want." "I know what I don't want," Rebecca corrected her. "That is not exactly the same thing, but it is a start." It was the first Thursday of April when Clayton Chandler rode into Harlow Creek, and he did not ride in the way that men who meant to make impressions usually rode. He came in from the North Road at a pace that suggested he had been traveling a long time and had no particular urgency about the last mile of it. His horse was a gray roan gelding, tall and lean and sensible looking, the kind of horse a person bought for reliability rather than appearance. Clayton himself was 27, though he did not look it in any way that was obvious. He had the kind of face that the frontier made lean and weathered and patient, with dark eyes that moved around a new place slowly and deliberately, taking inventory rather than performing interest. He wore a working man's clothes canvas trousers, a blue chambray shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbow, worn boots, and a hat that had seen significant weather. No silver conchos, no fancy stitching, Nothing about him announced itself. He tied his horse at the rail outside the general store, went in, bought 2 cans of beans, a small sack of coffee, a box of cartridges for a Winchester rifle, and a length of rope, paid for everything in exact coin without any particular conversation, and left. Mabel Good watched him go with the professional curiosity of a woman who filed and cross-referenced everyone who passed through her store. "Don't know him," she said to no one in particular. "New," said old Pete Haskell from the nail barrel, which was where Pete Haskell could be found at most hours of the day. "Obviously new," Mabel said. "The question is what kind of new?" The answer to that question began to emerge over the following week. Clayton Chandler had ridden down from the Kansas Cattle Trail, where he had spent the better part of 3 years working as a drover for one of the big outfits moving Texas longhorns north to the railheads. He had saved his wages with monastic discipline and had come south again with a specific intention: to find a piece of land worth working and to work it. He had heard that the grazing was good in the hill country south of Harlow Creek, and he had heard right. On his second day in the territory, he rode out past the edge of the settled land and found 160 acres of good grass and 1 dependable spring, unregistered and unclaimed, and he filed on it at the county land office on his 3rd day with the methodical efficiency of a man executing a plan he had been thinking about for a long time. He did not talk about himself while doing any of this. He answered direct questions with direct answers and volunteered nothing beyond what was asked. It was not unfriendliness. It was something quieter than that, a self-containment so natural and complete that it read less as reserve and more as a kind of integrity, the quality of a person who did not feel compelled to fill every silence with noise. Edmund Keller met him at the feed store on a Thursday morning, the way men in that territory met most people, accidentally, over a shared piece of practical business. They were both waiting for the same order of oat seed, and the wait was long enough that conversation became inevitable. "Edmund Keller," Edmund said, extending his hand. "Clayton Chandler." The handshake was firm and direct. "You run cattle east of town." "I do." "How do you know that?" "Past your place riding in. Good stock. Your longhorns are looking lean after the winter, but the bone structure on that bull you've got is something worth thinking about." It was said without flattery or criticism, purely as observation, the way a person with useful knowledge states facts. Edmund looked at him with sharpened attention. It took a real stockman to read a herd from the road at a distance. "You know cattle." "I've spent some time with them," Clayton said, and that was all. They talked cattle for another 40 minutes while they waited for the seed order, and by the end of it, Edmund had made a decision that he would later describe as one of the better pieces of judgment he had exercised in his life. "You filed on the Walker Spring land," he said. It was not a question. Information moved through the county land office the way water moved downhill. "That's right. Land is good. Water is better. You're going to need to fence before fall if you mean to run cattle on it." "I know that. You need any help with fencing, I can spare 2 hands for a week in May." Clayton looked at him steadily for a moment, as though taking the measure of the offer and the man who made it. "I appreciate that," he said. "I'll return the labor." "I know you will," Edmund said, with the simple certainty of a man who had been reading people for 52 years and had gotten fairly good at it. "Come to supper Sunday if you're willing. My daughter sets a table worth riding for." Clayton came to supper on Sunday. Rebecca had been given approximately 4 hours of warning, which was not enough time to form a defensive strategy, but was enough time to form an opinion. She had heard about the new man who had filed on the Walker Spring land. She had heard from Mabel's comprehensive intelligence service that he was 27, had come down from the Kansas Trail, was quiet, and had dark eyes and a gray roan horse. She had heard all of this, and she had formed the settled, preemptive conclusion that he was probably like all the others, decent enough, well-intentioned enough, and entirely wrong for her in the specific way that all the others had been entirely wrong for her, which was the way of men who had perfectly serviceable good qualities, but none of the indefinable, essential thing she was waiting for without being able to name it. She had the roast on and the biscuits in the oven, and was doing her best to feel completely neutral about the whole business when she heard the horse in the yard and looked out the kitchen window. He was taking his time with the horse. That was the first thing she noticed. He did not tie the animal at the post and walk away the way most men did. He took the bridle off first, checked the near foreleg with careful hands. The leg, she realized, must be giving some trouble, something she would not have known to look for, and then made sure the horse was settled before he turned toward the house. He did not know she was watching. It was not performance. It was just what he did when no one was looking, and that, Rebecca Keller thought, was a very different thing from what most people showed you when they were trying to be seen. She was at the stove when he came in with her father, and she turned to be introduced, and he took off his hat and looked at her. That was all. He just looked at her, not the look that men gave a woman they were appraising, not the look that said, "I have heard about you and here is my position on the matter." He just looked at her the way a person looks at something genuinely interesting, with a steady and uncomplicated attention, and said, "Miss Keller," in a voice that was quiet and even, and then he stopped talking, and the silence was somehow not awkward at all. Rebecca opened her mouth to say something properly welcoming and found, to her startlement, that she had absolutely no idea what to say. This had never happened to her before. She was a composed woman. She was a woman who always knew what to say. She stood there for half a second that felt considerably longer, and then she said, "Supper will be ready in about 20 minutes, which was both true and completely beside the point, and turned back to the stove. Edmund noticed. He was a perceptive man, and he had known his daughter for 24 years, and he had never in all that time seen her at a loss for a single word. He filed the observation away with the quiet care of a man who knows better than to remark on such things, and he led Clayton through to the sitting room. Supper was, by any measure, excellent. Rebecca cooked the way she did most things, with complete, unsentimental competence, and a refusal to consider failure as an option. The roast was right. The biscuits were right. The apple preserves she had put up in September were the dark, amber-sweet product of a particularly good apple year, and she set them out without comment because they did not need any. The conversation at the table was mostly between Edmund and Clayton, and it ranged across cattle management, the spring grass conditions, the weather patterns in the hill country, the particular challenges of fencing rocky ground, and the state of the cattle market since the big drives had started pushing north in earnest. Rebecca listened. She told herself she was listening because it was a small table and there was nowhere else to look, but that was not entirely true, and somewhere beneath the surface she was aware of this. Clayton spoke carefully and without waste. He had opinions and he stated them directly, but he never steamrolled Edmund's observations or talked past a question to make room for his own point. When he disagreed, twice, over the matter of the best approach to drift fencing and the question of whether the hill country grass would hold longhorns at the density Edmund suggested, he said so plainly and explained his reasoning without apology, and then listened to Edmund's counterargument with genuine attention. He changed his position on the drift fencing question after Edmund's explanation. He held his ground on the density question. He was right on both counts, though Rebecca only confirmed this much later when she did her own reading on the subject. She spoke to him exactly 4 times during supper. Once to offer him more biscuits, which he accepted with a thank you that suggested he meant it. Once to ask whether the roan had thrown a shoe. She had noticed the favored leg, which produced the first moment of complete silence, and then a look from him that was somehow both surprised and not surprised, as if she had confirmed a suspicion he had formed earlier. His horse had indeed thrown a shoe 3 miles out of town, and he had walked the animal the rest of the way in, which was the only sensible thing to do. He asked how she had known. She told him she had been watching from the kitchen window. Another small silence, and then he nodded, just once, the way a person nods when something makes sense to them. Once to correct a minor error in Edmund's account of the county land records, which she knew better than he did because she handled the family's administrative correspondence. And once, near the end of the meal, to tell him that the Walker Spring had run clean and reliable through the drought of 1874, which was the worst water year anyone in the county could remember. So if it was still there now, it would likely see him through whatever came next. He listened to all four of these contributions the same way, with the same steady, unperformed attention, and each time said exactly what was necessary and nothing else. After supper, Edmund excused himself to go check on the cattle, which was not an obvious departure from his routine, but was specifically executed at this moment, with the particular subtlety of a 52-year-old man who had suddenly recovered all the romantic scheming capacity of a much younger person. Rebecca, who was not fooled for a single moment, cleared the supper dishes with deliberate calm and did not watch her father go. She was at the wash basin when she became aware that Clayton had not gone out with Edmund, but was standing a reasonable distance behind her, holding his own plate in the quiet, uncertain way of a guest who is not sure of the protocol. She turned, and he held out the plate, and she took it, and for a moment they were both just standing there in the kitchen in the lamplight with absolutely nothing arranged between them. "You don't have to help," she said. "I know," he said. She turned back to the wash basin. He stood there a moment more, and then he picked up the drying cloth from the hook beside the stove and waited. She washed. He dried. Neither of them said anything for a while, and the silence was not uncomfortable. It was the particular comfortable silence that exists between two people who are not performing anything for each other, which is a rarer thing than it sounds and considerably more meaningful. "You knew a lot about the Walker Spring," he said eventually. "I've ridden that country since I was a child," she said. "My mother used to take us out there in July because of the shade. There's a stand of live oak to the east of the spring that she liked." A pause. "Is she gone?" "Yes, 11 years. I'm sorry." 2 words. No elaboration, no rush to fill the space after them with something that would dilute them. Just the words, set down clean, and then the respectful silence of a person who knows when to stop. Rebecca stared at the dish she was washing for a moment longer than it needed. "Thank you," she said. He was gone by 9 o'clock, which was a polite and appropriate hour to leave, and he shook Edmund's hand at the door and nodded to Rebecca and put his hat on and walked out to the horse in the yard. She watched from the window, again without quite meaning to, and saw him check the foreleg again before he mounted, the same careful, unperforming habit. And then he rode out under a sky absolutely crowded with stars. Edmund came to stand beside her at the window, and they both watched the lamplight from the horse and rider grow small in the darkness. "Well," Edmund said. "Don't," Rebecca said. "I wasn't going to say anything." "You were absolutely going to say something." Edmund was quiet for one more moment, and then he said, "He's a good man, Rebecca," in the tone of a person who is not making an argument but simply recording a fact for the archive, and then he went to bed. Rebecca stayed at the window for a little while after that. May came in warm and promising, and Clayton Chandler began fencing the Walker Spring land with the methodical intensity of a man building something he intended to last. Edmund sent 2 hands as promised brothers named Eli and Tom Vargas, who were solid workers and excellent company. And on the 2nd Saturday of the month, Edmund himself rode out to help and brought Rebecca along, ostensibly because she wanted to see the progress, and because there was no sensible reason for her not to come. The Walker Spring land was beautiful in a way that the hill country often was: rolling grass and cedar, and the occasional limestone outcrop, with the quality of light that the Texas highlands got in May, which was clear and clean and just warm enough. The spring itself was in a low spot surrounded by the live oak stand her mother had loved, and the water was as good as she remembered, cold and clean and tasting of limestone. Clayton was already working when they arrived, setting posts with the efficient, economical motion of a person who had done physical labor for a long time and had learned to waste nothing. He greeted Edmund with his usual direct handshake and nodded to Rebecca, and then everyone fell into the work, and the morning moved forward. Rebecca worked alongside everyone else, because standing around watching was not something she did. She helped tamp posts and string wire and hold timber in position while it was nailed, and she worked with the same competent matter-of-factness that characterized everything she did, and nobody thought anything of it because the women of that territory had always worked alongside the men, whatever anyone in the eastern cities might have preferred to think about the matter. At noon, when the heat had climbed enough to make a break necessary, they sat in the shade of the live oaks and ate the lunch Rebecca had brought: cold biscuits, dried beef, and a jar of the apple preserves, along with a jug of water from the spring. Clayton sat with his back against one of the big oaks and ate in his usual quiet way, and Rebecca sat about 5 feet from him and tried to be entirely absorbed in the biscuit she was eating, which she was not. Eli Vargas, who was 23 and had approximately no social discretion whatsoever, looked at the two of them for about 30 seconds and then said cheerfully to Tom, "I could really use a nap," and both brothers immediately wandered to a patch of shade 20 yards away and appeared to fall asleep with implausible speed. Edmund, who was developing a deep appreciation for the Vargas brothers, discovered that he needed to check something on the south fence line and walked purposefully in that direction. Rebecca watched everyone leave with the specific expression of a person who is being managed and knows it, and is trying to decide how to feel about that. She looked down at her apple preserves. She looked at the spring. She looked at a cardinal that had landed in the live oak above Clayton's head. "The fence line on the east looks like it's going to be difficult," she said, because she had to say something. "The limestone runs very close to the surface there." "I know," he said. "I'm going to have to go around it in some places. It'll add about 40 yards to the total run. Do you have enough wire?" "Just enough. I checked the arithmetic twice." She looked at him then and found that he was looking at her, not performing the look, not trying to create an effect with it, just looking at her in that honest, interested way he had, as if she were genuinely worth looking at. "You check your arithmetic twice," she said. "Don't you? Always." Something that might have been the beginning of a smile moved very briefly across his face. Not quite all the way to a smile, more the suggestion of one, like the first light before sunrise. "Your father says you keep the household accounts," he said. "I keep everything," she said. "Papa manages the animals, I manage everything else." "That sounds like a lot." "It is what it is," she said, which was the same answer he would have given to the same question, and they both seemed to realize this at the same moment, and the brief pause that followed had a quality that was different from their previous silences, warmer somehow, more specific. "I need to learn the books properly," he said then. "I can do basic figures, but I've never managed a full set of accounts." Rebecca turned this over. "I could show you," she said, and then immediately wondered why she had said it, and then decided that she had said it because it was a reasonable offer and she was not going to take it back. He looked at her steadily. "I'd appreciate that." And that was how it started, really, not with declarations or performances, but with ledger books and fencing arithmetic and the particular domestic logic of two people who were good at practical things and respected competence in others. Clayton began coming to the Keller homestead on Thursday evenings, ostensibly to go over the bookkeeping he needed to learn for his operation. Edmund would sit in the corner with his newspaper and pretend to be absorbed in it, while Rebecca spread the ledger books on the kitchen table and showed Clayton the system she used to track income and expenditure, the method of logging beef prices against feed costs, the way she projected forward 3 months to anticipate cash needs. He was a quick learner. More than quick, he had a mind that moved fast beneath the quiet surface, and he asked good questions, precise and specific, the kind that indicated he had already thought about the shape of the answer and wanted to verify his thinking. Rebecca was not accustomed to being asked good questions. Most of the men she knew either did not care what she thought or did not understand what she was explaining. Clayton did both cared and understood, with a combination that she found increasingly difficult to organize her usual composure around. She started noticing things she had not noticed at first. The care he took with his words, not because he was cautious or defensive, but because he believed that what he said should actually mean what it sounded like it meant. The way he looked at a problem from all angles before he committed to a position. The particular quality of his patience, which was not the passive patience of a man waiting for something to happen, but the active patience of a person who understood that good things required time and refused to resent that requirement. The fact that he laughed rarely but genuinely, and when he did it transformed his whole face in a way that she found herself thinking about later, in the evenings in the kitchen, with a wooden spoon in her hand and a stew that didn't need as much attention as she was pretending to give it. She also noticed that he never said anything about the 11 men. Not a word. The whole territory knew the count. Everyone in Harlow Creek had an opinion about it. But Clayton Chandler never referenced it, never made a joke about it, never gave any indication that her history of rejections was a subject he had filed under romantic challenge or competitive opportunity. He treated her exactly the way he treated everything else, with straightforward respect, and the assumption that she was precisely as competent as she appeared to be, without qualification or condescension. This turned out to be the most devastating thing anyone had ever done to her. She had not expected it and had no defenses prepared for it. June arrived, and with it a complication. His name was Wade Cutler, and he had come down from Fort Worth with 3 other men, and an unspecified interest in acquiring grazing land in the area south of Harlow Creek. He was a large, loud, self-assured man in his early 40s, with the ease of someone accustomed to getting what he wanted. And what he wanted, it quickly became apparent, was the Walker Spring land that Clayton had filed on in April. He came to the county land office first, and Sheriff Bart Morrison, a lean, careful man who had kept the peace in Harlow Creek for 8 years, watched the interaction with professional attention and did not like what he saw. Cutler was the kind of man who treated the machinery of law as an inconvenience to be navigated rather than a boundary to be respected, and he had associates with him who had the particular stillness of men, paid to be still, when someone else was talking and active when they were told to be. Word of Cutler's interest reached Clayton through Tom Vargas, who heard it from Pete Haskell at the Nail Barrel, which was the standard route for such communications. Clayton received the information with the same equanimity he received everything else, went to the county office to verify that his filing was properly recorded and witnessed. It was, and he had the paper copy stored in 2 places, as a man with sense and no particular faith in luck would do, and then went about his work. Rebecca heard about Cutler from Mabel Good and felt something sharp and cold move through her chest that she identified with some surprise as worry. Specific worry. The kind that is attached to a specific person. She thought about the Walker Spring, the live oaks, the fence that Clayton had built with 40 extra yards of wire around the limestone shelving. She thought about the way he had walked that land when he thought no one was watching, with the particular reverence of a person who has found the thing they were looking for after a long search. She mentioned it to Edmund over breakfast. "I know about Cutler," Edmund said. "What are you going to do?" "What do you mean, what am I going to do? Chandler's filing is clean. The law is straightforward." "The law is straightforward," Rebecca agreed. "That is not always the same thing as what actually happens." She had been in Harlow Creek for 24 years. She had seen what men with money and muscle could do to what was technically correct. Edmund set down his coffee cup and looked at his daughter with the expression of a man whose own concern he has been trying to minimize, now seen clearly reflected in someone else. "I'll ride out and check on him," he said. "I'll come," Rebecca said. Edmund did not argue. Clayton was out at the spring property when they arrived, and Wade Cutler was there as well, with 2 of his men on the other side of the new fence line. The confrontation was quiet, which was sometimes more frightening than loud. Cutler stood at the fence with the proprietorial ease of a man who has decided the fence is temporary, and Clayton stood on his side of it with his thumbs in his belt, and a stillness that Rebecca recognized, not passive stillness, but the coiled, deliberate stillness of a person who has made all his decisions and is simply waiting for the situation to declare its nature. "The land is filed clean," Clayton was saying as Edmund and Rebecca came up. His voice was even and unhurried. "The filing is witnessed and recorded at the county office. You are welcome to verify that yourself." "I've verified it," Cutler said, with a smile that did not involve his eyes. "I'm also prepared to make you a price that would make the whole question irrelevant, a generous price. It's not for sale. Everything is for sale at the right number." "That is a common belief," Clayton said. "It isn't accurate in this case." He paused. "I'd appreciate it if you and your men moved off my land now." Cutler looked at him for a long moment, doing the calculation that men like Cutler always did, assessing the likely cost of pressure versus the likely yield. Something in what he saw seemed to give him pause, because after a moment he turned his horse and his men followed, and they rode south without what looked like they had originally intended. Edmund pulled up beside Clayton. "You all right?" "Fine," Clayton said, in the tone of a man who has been in worse situations and found this one entirely manageable. He looked past Edmund to where Rebecca sat on her horse, and their eyes met across the summer air, and she felt the full force of that steady, unhurried look land somewhere in the middle of her chest with a precision that was almost physical. "Thank you for coming," he said. He was talking to Edmund, but he was looking at her. "I told you you'd need neighbors," Edmund said. "You did," Clayton said. "You were right." Cutler did not give up immediately. Over the following 2 weeks, he made 2 more visits to the land and sent a letter through a lawyer in San Antonio, suggesting that there might be procedural issues with the original filing that could be challenged in court. Sheriff Morrison, who had been watching the situation carefully, paid Cutler a personal visit and had a conversation that was reported by Tom Vargas, who somehow always knew things, to have been brief and extremely clear in its implications. Morrison had kept the peace in Harlow Creek for 8 years, by being fundamentally fair to everyone and absolutely inflexible about the boundary between legal competition and something else. Cutler left the county 10 days later, taking his associates with him, and the matter was closed. Rebecca learned of his departure on a Tuesday and felt a relief so complete and physical that she had to set down what she was doing and stand still for a moment in the kitchen, with one hand on the table, taking a full breath. She did not examine this reaction closely, but she did not pretend it had not happened. The Thursday evening sessions with the ledger books continued through June and into July, and they had long since stopped being only about bookkeeping. They had become the particular ritual of 2 people who have found that they prefer each other's company to almost anything else available, and have not yet worked out what to do about that. Rebecca would have the kitchen table set up with the accounts and the current month's records, and Clayton would come at 7 and they would work through the numbers, and then they would talk sometimes about practical things, the cattle markets and the spring grass and the conditions in the county, and sometimes about things that were harder to categorize. He told her about the Kansas Trail in July, about the particular quality of the prairie darkness at night, the sound of 3,000 cattle moving in the quiet, the way a thunderstorm on the open plain could be terrifying and beautiful simultaneously, the men who drove the herds north year after year and were being slowly squeezed out as the railroads pushed further west and the open range began to be divided. He talked about these things without sentimentality but with a specificity that meant he had paid attention to all of it, had thought about what he was seeing while he was seeing it, which was, Rebecca had come to understand, characteristic of him. She told him about her mother. She had not talked about Charlotte Keller in a long time, not because the grief was still raw, but because she had learned that most people did not know what to do with her mother's memory, tended to make it smaller or tidier than it actually was. Charlotte had been an unusual woman, highly educated for a frontier wife, sharp and funny, and entirely devoted to the peculiar project of raising her daughter to be exactly herself, rather than some more manageable version of female usefulness. She had also been deeply, specifically in love with Edmund Keller, in a way that Rebecca had grown up watching and had never quite found the words for until now. The way her father could come into a room, and her mother's whole quality of attention would shift, not dramatically, just a fraction, the way a compass needle shifts when it finds north. Clayton listened to all of this without interruption, and when she was done he said, "She sounds like she was remarkable," in a tone that meant it, and then he said nothing else, and the nothing else was exactly right. "She was," Rebecca said. "I think she would have liked you." He looked at her. The evening light was coming through the kitchen window at the angle that meant it was about 8:30, and it caught the angles of his face and made him look older and younger at the same time. "I hope so," he said quietly. And then, after a pause, "I'd have wanted her too." The implication of this, that her mother's opinion mattered to him in the specific way it would matter if he intended to be a permanent presence in the life of her daughter, sat between them in the kitchen air, clear and careful and entirely unasked for as a direct statement, and Rebecca felt her heart move in her chest with a decisiveness it had never demonstrated before. She looked down at the ledger book. "We should finish the August projections," she said. "Of course," he said, and they did, and when he left at 9 o'clock and said good night from the doorway, he looked at her with those dark, patient eyes, and she found she could not look away first. Edmund, who had been reading his newspaper in the corner with the sustained attention of a man who was not listening to a single word of it, waited until the sound of Clayton's horse faded from the yard and then said, without looking up, "You could just tell him, you know." "Tell him what?" Rebecca said with perfect composure. Edmund turned a page of his newspaper. "That you've completely lost your head," he said mildly. "In my experience, it saves time." "I have not lost my head," Rebecca said. "Rebecca Ann Keller," her father said, setting down the newspaper and looking at her with the full weight of his 52 years and the specific, weathered wisdom of a man who had loved one woman completely and knew what that looked like from the outside. "You have been checking the road every evening around 6:50 for the past 3 weeks." Rebecca opened her mouth and then closed it because she had in fact been checking the road every evening around 6:50, and she had not consciously known this until this precise moment, and the knowing of it landed on her with the force of a stone dropped into still water. She sat down. "Oh," she said. "There it is," Edmund said gently and picked up his newspaper again. She went out on the porch and sat in the evening dark for a long time, watching the stars come out over the hill country, and she thought about Jerome Pickard and Carson Dye and the 10 others before them, and she understood with a clarity that was simultaneously wonderful and frightening exactly what had been missing in all of them, and exactly what was present in Clayton Chandler, and it was so specific and so complete that she could not believe she had not named it before. It was the sensation of being known. Not the performance of being admired or the transaction of being wanted, but the actual experience of being genuinely known by a person who saw all of it. The competence and the stubbornness and the loneliness and the apple preserves and the way she checked the road at 6:50 and found it not merely acceptable but, somehow, precisely right. She had been waiting for this. She had known she was waiting for it without being able to name it, and now she could name it, and the naming of it was so large and so final that she sat with it a good while before she went back inside. The following Thursday, she was not nervous. Nervousness was not, as a rule, something she experienced, and she saw no reason to begin. She was, however, aware of an alertness in herself that she did not usually carry, a heightened attention to everything, the way the air smelled of cedar and approaching summer rain, the sound of his horse in the yard at 5 minutes to 7, the particular weight of the moment before the knock at the door. She opened the door before he knocked. He stood there with his hat in his hand and the evening light behind him, and something in her expression must have told him that tonight was different, because he went still in the particular way he did when he was paying close attention. "Come in," she said. He came in. She did not set out the ledger books. "There's something I want to tell you," she said, standing in the center of the kitchen. "And I want to tell it to you clearly without managing it too much, which is a habit I have." She looked at him directly. "I have been very careful with my feelings for a very long time. I told myself it was standards. I told myself I was waiting for something real. And both of those things were true, but what I didn't understand until recently was what real actually looked like, for me specifically." He was watching her with absolute attention. He had not moved. He had not said a word, and his silence was not absence. It was presence, the specific presence of a person who is giving you their complete and unhurried self. "Real," she said, "turns out to look like a man who checks his horse's leg when he thinks nobody is watching, and who says exactly what he means, and who dries the dishes in my kitchen without making a production of it, and learns the books because he actually wants to understand them, and has never once made me feel like my opinions were a problem to be managed around." She paused. The rain was beginning, a light, tentative sound on the roof. "I'm not asking you for anything. I'm telling you what is true. I think I am in love with you, Clayton Chandler, and I wanted you to know it, because not saying true things out of caution seems to me the waste of a perfectly good life." The silence that followed was the longest of the several significant silences they had shared, and it had a quality unlike any of the others, charged and still and very full. He set his hat on the table. He crossed the kitchen in 2 steps. He took her face in both his hands, very gently, with the same careful attention he gave to the horse's leg, to the fence posts, to everything he did that mattered, and he looked at her close now, so that she could see all the patience and the depth and the particular, specific, irreplaceable quality of his dark eyes. "Rebecca," he said, very quietly, "I rode into this town in April with one plan, which was to build something worth keeping on a piece of good land. I have been revising that plan since approximately the first Sunday I sat at your father's table." He paused. "I have not said anything because I did not want to be one more man telling you what he wanted without listening to what you wanted. I was trying to wait until I was sure you knew your own mind." "I know my own mind," she said, and her voice was steady and entirely certain. "I know you do," he said. "That is one of the things I love about you." He kissed her then, carefully and completely, the way he did everything, and the rain came fully in at last against the roof of the kitchen, and the cedar smell of it came through the window, and Rebecca Keller, who had turned down 11 men in a year and 3 counties worth of perfectly decent suitors before them, discovered with absolute clarity that she had not been difficult or unreasonable or too particular. She had simply been right. Edmund came in from the sitting room about 10 minutes later with the elaborate casualness of a man who was not at all keeping track of time, and found them standing in the kitchen with the rain loud on the roof, and the look on his daughter's face that he had last seen on her mother's face, some 30 years ago, in a different kitchen, in a different state, in the first weeks of a life together that had been full and real and worth every day of it. He looked at Clayton. Clayton looked back at him. "Sir," Clayton said, "I would very much like to speak with you about your daughter." Edmund picked up the coffee pot. "I'll make coffee," he said, in the tone of a man who has been waiting for this conversation for approximately 3 months and has prepared everything he wants to say. "Sit down." They talked until midnight, the 3 of them, and when Clayton rode home through the light, clean rain, the land smelled of cedar and wet grass in summer, and the stars were hidden, but the sky was so dark and soft that it felt close, like something you could reach up and touch. He asked her formally 3 weeks later, on a Sunday afternoon in the shade of the live oaks above the Walker Spring, where the water was cold and clean, and had run through the worst drought in memory without failing. He did not make a speech. He had brought nothing except himself and the ring, which had belonged to his grandmother and was a simple band of gold with a small garnet, and he held it out to her and said, "Will you come and build this with me? Not just the house and the fences, all of it." She looked at the ring and then at him, and said yes with such immediate simplicity that he laughed, the real laugh, the transforming one. and she put the ring on her own finger because she was a woman who knew how to take care of what was hers. And then she laughed too, and the live oaks made their cedar and shade sounds above them, and the spring ran cold and clear below. They were married on a Saturday in September of 1878 in the little white Methodist church at the edge of Harlow Creek, which was filled well beyond its intended capacity because, as Mabel Good observed accurately, everyone in 3 counties had a personal stake in the outcome of this particular love story and was not about to miss its resolution. Hattie Morse, who was 81 and had been in that territory longer than almost anyone, sat in the front pew and watched the whole thing with the expression of a woman whose prediction has been confirmed. She had said, at the general store in April, that the Keller girl was waiting for something real. She had been correct, and she intended to mention this to Mabel Good at the first reasonable opportunity. Rebecca wore her mother's blue dress, let out slightly at the waist and taken in at the shoulders to fit her precisely, and she carried a small bunch of the wild autumn flowers that grew along the creek, and she walked down the aisle with her father on one arm and her own absolute calm composure, which everyone in Harlow Creek had always admired and slightly feared, worn now with a particular softness that no one had quite seen on her before. Clayton waited for her at the front with the Reverend William Holt, who had performed weddings in Harlow Creek for 15 years and had the good sense to keep the ceremony to the essential and the meaningful without ornamentation. When Rebecca came to stand beside Clayton, he looked at her the way he had looked at her from the beginning, that same steady, unhurried, uncomplicated attention, and she looked back at him, and the whole packed church seemed to take a collective breath. Maria Garza, sitting in the 3rd row with her husband and 4 children, felt something in her chest that was specifically, uncynically hope. She squeezed her husband Carlos's hand, and he squeezed back without looking at her, because after 17 years he did not need to look to know. Daniel Keller, Rebecca's brother, who was 20 and had come up from San Antonio, where he was working at a law office, sat with their father and watched his sister's face during the ceremony and felt proud of her in the specific way of a younger sibling who has always understood his older sister to be remarkable and is glad, finally, that someone else has figured it out. They said their vows with the directness that characterized both of them. No false starts, no nervous mumbling, just the words said plainly and completely, because both of them believed that promises should sound like what they were. When Reverend Holt said the part about "you may kiss the bride," Clayton kissed her with exactly the right amount of care, and the town of Harlow Creek, 3 counties of neighbors, Mabel Good and old Hattie Morse and the Vargas brothers and Sheriff Morrison, and everyone else who had watched this particular story unfold cheered with genuine, wholehearted enthusiasm. The wedding supper was held at the Keller homestead, on tables set up in the yard under a sky that had been considerately clear since morning. Edmund had killed 2 of his best steers. Maria Garza had brought 3 kinds of tamales and a pot of beans that made everyone rethink everything they thought they knew about beans. Mabel Good brought pies, 6 of them, apple and peach, and 1 mysterious dark berry variety that she refused to identify, and that everyone agreed was the best thing they had eaten since memory began. There was music. A fiddle and a banjo played by 2 brothers from the Garza extended family who had driven up from their ranch to the south, and the dancing went on in the dusty yard until well past 10 o'clock. Clayton danced exactly once, with Rebecca, as was appropriate, and then once more with old Hattie Morse, who demanded it, and who turned out to be a considerably more vigorous dancer than her 81 years might have suggested. Edmund danced with Maria Garza while her husband clapped the time, and Daniel Keller danced with every unmarried woman present in the slightly desperate way of a 20-year-old, who has recently discovered that his sister has ruined his own romantic life by setting an impossible standard. Rebecca danced with Clayton in the yard under the stars with the fiddle going and the smell of cedar and autumn, and the dust of the dancing all around them, and she felt something settle in her that had been restless and searching for as long as she could remember. Felt it settle the way water settles after it finds its level, complete and quiet and permanent. "Are you happy?" He asked her very quietly, not for the benefit of anyone else. She looked up at him. "I think I have been moving toward this for my whole life," she said. "So yes, completely." They moved into the Walker Spring house in October, which Clayton had been building since August with help from Edmund and the Vargas brothers and Tom Garza, Maria's eldest son, who was 16 and a natural carpenter. The house was modest by Eastern standards, 2 rooms initially, with the framing for 2 more already in place for future addition. But it was solidly built and thoughtfully arranged, with big windows because Rebecca liked light and a kitchen that faced east to catch the morning sun, because Clayton had noticed without being told that she was a morning person who did her best thinking before 9 o'clock. She brought her ledger books and her preserving jars and her McGuffey readers and the particular blue pitcher that had been her mother's, and she set the blue pitcher on the kitchen windowsill where the morning light hit it, and she looked around the 2 rooms of her new house with the live oaks visible through the window and the spring glittering in the October sunlight below, and she understood that she had arrived somewhere she had been traveling toward for a very long time. The first winter of their marriage was cold and dry and hard, in the practical ways that winters on the Texas frontier were hard: firewood and water and cattle, and the daily arithmetic of survival. They moved through it as a unit, with the efficient, complementary quality of 2 people who are genuinely suited to each other, who do not duplicate each other's strengths or compound each other's weaknesses, but fit together with the specific satisfaction of things that were made to go together. Rebecca kept the books for both operations now: the Keller homestead, which Edmund still ran with the Vargas brothers, and the Chandler Spring property, which Clayton was building methodically from the ground up. She had also taken on an additional responsibility that had grown organically from her Tuesday and Thursday lessons with the Garza children. 3 more families had asked if their children could join, and what had been informal tutoring had become, by January of 1879, a proper school session 4 days a week in the Chandler kitchen, with 8 children between the ages of 6 and 12, sitting on benches around the table with their slates and their McGuffey readers, while Rebecca taught them reading and arithmetic, and the geography of a world most of them would never see. Clayton built a separate schoolroom onto the house in February, not waiting to be asked, simply doing it because he had assessed the situation and determined it was necessary, which was his characteristic approach to all problems. He built it with a good window and a proper hearth and enough bench space for 12, because he calculated that the number would grow, and he was right. Maria Garza came to Rebecca one morning in February after the school session and sat at the kitchen table with her coffee and said, "You are happy." "I am," Rebecca said. "I told you," Maria said, "something real." "You told me," Rebecca agreed. "I knew you were right. I just didn't know yet what right looked like." "It looks like this," Maria said, gesturing at the house, the morning light on the blue pitcher, the smell of the school fire from the next room, the sound of Clayton outside doing something useful and unhurried. "It looks exactly like this." Spring came back to the hill country in 1879 with a particular generosity, a long, warm, well-watered spring that filled the creeks and brought the grass up thick and dark and early. Clayton's first full season on the Walker Spring land went well enough that by June he had 20 head of his own cattle on the property, and the fence was holding, and the spring was running sweet and cold, and the live oaks were the specific perfect green of a good year. He and Edmund had developed, over the course of the winter and spring, the kind of relationship between a father-in-law and a son-in-law that is considerably rarer than it should be. A genuine mutual respect built on shared competence and a similar understanding of the world, without competition or tension or the power struggles that such relationships often involved. Edmund treated Clayton as an equal from the beginning, which Clayton responded to with a particular quiet loyalty that Edmund found deeply satisfying. They consulted each other about their respective operations with the unsentimental practicality of men who had both figured out that pride was expensive and knowledge was worth more. And Rebecca thrived. This was what Clayton saw when he came in from the fields and found her at the kitchen table with her ledger books, or heard her voice from the schoolroom explaining long division to 8 children who were, by February, genuinely beginning to understand it, or watched her ride out to the Garza homestead on a Tuesday afternoon with the easy confidence of a woman who owns her world. She was the most capable person he had ever known and the most entirely herself, and both of these things made him love her more specifically every day, not in the diminishing way that familiarity can produce, but in the increasing way of something that gets richer the more you know of it. He was not a man who said this kind of thing easily, because he was not a man who said anything easily unless he meant it completely. But one evening in May, when the school was finished for the day and the dinner things were cleared and they were sitting on the porch in the last of the light with the hill country laid out below them and the spring glittering in the distance, he said, "I want you to know something." She looked at him. "I had a specific plan," he said, "when I rode into Harlow Creek last spring. I knew exactly what I was building and why and how, and I was right about most of it." He paused. "But I was wrong about the most important thing, which was what I was building it for. I thought I was building it for myself. I was wrong about that. I was building it for this, for you and this and what we are doing here together." He looked at her directly. "I wanted to say that clearly because I think things that are true should be said." Rebecca looked at him for a long moment, and then she reached over and took his hand, and they sat there in the last of the evening light with the hill country around them and the spring below, and the schoolroom they had built together off the side of the house, and the cattle in the good spring grass and all the practical, beloved machinery of their shared life surrounding them. "I know," she said. "I feel it the same way. Every single day." He turned his hand and held hers, and they sat there until the stars came out. In October of 1879, Rebecca told him she was expecting a child. She told him in the kitchen in the morning, because she was a morning person and important things should be said when a person was at their clearest. She had been reasonably certain for about 3 weeks and had spent those 3 weeks being medically practical about it. She had spoken with Dr. Francis Aldrich, who had come to Harlow Creek the previous year, and whose presence was still the subject of complicated feelings among the town's male population, who had opinions about female doctors that Francis Aldrich had no time for, and had satisfied herself that everything was proceeding normally before she said anything to Clayton. She told him while she was making coffee, because she also believed there was no reason to arrange theater around truth. "I am expecting a child," she said. "Dr. Aldrich says the spring, probably April or May." He set down the harness strap he was oiling and looked at her with a fullness in his expression that she had rarely seen, that reserve dropped, the whole depth of it visible, unguarded. He stood up and came across the kitchen and took her hands in his. "Are you all right?" he said. "I am perfectly well," she said. "I feel fine. I am not frightened. I would like you not to treat me as if I am fragile because I am not, and I will find it very irritating." Something in his expression shifted the beginning of that transforming laugh. "I know you're not fragile," he said. "I'm the one who's going to be a father. I'm the one who might need a moment." She laughed then, a real laugh, rare and bright, and he put his arms around her in the kitchen with the coffee smell and the morning light on the blue pitcher, and he held her with that characteristic care, as if she were exactly as valuable as she was, which was very. Edmund, told at Sunday dinner, sat very still for a moment and then cleared his throat several times and found something requiring his urgent attention outside, and was seen by Daniel, who had come back to visit from San Antonio and had very good eyesight, standing alone in the yard with his hand over his eyes in a manner entirely inconsistent with looking at anything in particular. Daniel was 21 now and had the growing awareness of a young man who has been away from home for a year, and returned to find that everything has shifted slightly in his absence, and all of it for the better. He watched his sister and Clayton at the Sunday table, and saw in it the thing he had been hoping to see for as long as he could remember without knowing he was hoping for it: Rebecca fully met. He toasted them with his water glass and made a joke about the schoolroom needing to prepare for a new pupil, and Rebecca threw a piece of bread at him, and Clayton caught it, which demonstrated a useful reflexiveness. The winter of 1879 to 1880 was a working winter and a waiting winter, and both things were fine. Rebecca continued the school through February, because Dr. Aldrich told her that healthy women in healthy pregnancies did not need to be confined, and Aldrich's opinions on such matters were not suggestions. She modified the practical work she did around the homestead as the season advanced, with the specific graceful adaptation of a person who is accustomed to solving problems. And if she sometimes felt the weight of physical change with more complexity than she had anticipated, she dealt with that privately and without drama, in the way she dealt with all difficult things. Clayton was, in the quiet way that was natural to him, completely attentive. He did not fuss. He did not hover. He did not treat her as though she had lost the capacity for her own judgment, which she had observed other husbands doing, and which she had always considered a form of disrespect dressed up as concern. What he did was the things that needed doing without waiting to be asked: the water, the firewood, the heavier work, and he checked in with her in the evenings with the same direct, honest attention he gave everything, asking how she was and listening to the actual answer rather than the reassurance. On a warm morning in the last week of April 1880, in the bedroom of the Walker Spring house, with Dr. Francis Aldrich attending and Clayton in the kitchen doing a very determined job of being calm, Rebecca Keller Chandler brought a son into the world. He was large and healthy and loud, with dark eyes that were clearly going to stay dark, and a quality of considered attention in his expression that, as Dr. Aldrich observed dryly, was recognizable from approximately the first hour. Clayton came in when Aldrich called him, and stood at the bedside looking at his wife holding their son, and did not say anything at all for a long time. Rebecca, who was exhausted and complete and more herself than she had ever been in her life, looked up at him and saw his face completely unguarded and entirely full, and understood that she was looking at the depth of him in a way that very few people ever saw the depth of a man like this. "Hello," he said finally to the baby. The word was soft and careful and total. "He needs a name," Rebecca said. "We agreed on Henry." "Henry Clayton Chandler," she said, "for your father." He sat on the edge of the bed and looked at his son, and the spring light was coming through the window of the bedroom they had built together, and the live oaks outside were in full early leaf, and the spring below the house was running cold and clean. "Thank you," he said to her, very quietly in the private language of two people who have learned each other completely, "for all of it, for choosing this." "Thank you," she said, equally quiet, "for giving me something worth choosing." Edmund arrived at noon and held his grandson with the particular terrified reverence of a man holding the future, and then went outside again to stand in the yard and look at the hill country for a while, which appeared to be his method of processing all large emotions, and nobody bothered him about it. Maria Garza came in the afternoon with food and her eldest daughter Lucia, who was 14 now and had learned to read in Rebecca's kitchen, and was going to be, everyone privately agreed, formidable. She held baby Henry with the experienced ease of a woman who had done it many times and smiled at Rebecca over his head. "He is serious," she said, "like his father." "I know," Rebecca said. "God help us all." Clayton, who had heard this from the doorway, allowed himself the full laugh this time. The school continued in the autumn, with 10 children now, because word had spread. Dr. Aldrich had joined Rebecca one afternoon in September with a proposition. The county had been discussing the establishment of a proper schoolhouse in Harlow Creek, and there was no one better placed or better qualified to run it than Rebecca Chandler, who had by now been teaching 4 days a week for nearly 2 years and had results that spoke for themselves. Would she consider making it official? Rebecca considered it for approximately 4 seconds. Yes, she said. On the condition that the school serves every child in the county regardless of their family's origin. The Garza children and the children from the Mexican homesteads to the south. All of them. Dr. Aldrich, who had dealt with enough resistance to basic fairness in her own professional life to have strong feelings on the subject, said, "Absolutely, and if anyone objects they can have the discussion with me," which was widely reported as the best response to anything that had been heard in Harlow Creek in years. The county schoolhouse was finished in the spring of 1881. It was a proper frame building with 6 windows and 20 bench spaces, and a stove and a blackboard. And it was built on a corner lot in Harlow Creek that Edmund Keller donated because his daughter had asked him, and because it was the right thing to do, and because Edmund Keller had always known what the right thing was even when it was inconvenient. The school opened in September of 1881 with 18 students, which was more than anyone had planned for and required immediate addition of 2 more benches. Clayton built the benches. He also built a bookshelf along the back wall because there were books coming in from an Eastern publisher that Dr. Aldrich had contacted, and books needed shelves, and this was simply what you did. Henry Chandler, 14 months old in September of 1881, was not yet a student but was in attendance on many days regardless, supervised by whichever of the older Garza children was having a slow lesson morning, and he developed an early and enthusiastic relationship with the classroom chalk that required ongoing management. Rebecca stood at the front of her schoolhouse on the first morning, with the 18 faces arranged before her, ranging from 6-year-old Tomas Garza, who was Maria and Carlos's youngest, to 15-year-old Agnes Pickard, Jerome Pickard's niece, as it happened, which Rebecca found the universe had arranged with a specific sense of humor, and felt something in her chest that was not just satisfaction, but the particular satisfaction of a purpose that fits a person exactly, like a well-made boot. She had wanted, without being able to articulate it clearly, to make something that mattered. To do something that went beyond the household and the accounts and the managing of practical things, important as all of those were. She had wanted to build something that would last after her, something that would open the world for people to whom the world had not always been open. She looked at the 18 faces and thought about Tomas Garza, who would learn to read in this room and who might, if the world moved in the direction that justice pointed, grow up to be anything he chose. She thought about Agnes Pickard, who was sharp and hungry for learning, and who lived in a territory that had not always known what to do with sharp, hungry girls. She thought about what her own mother had done for her and what she now had the chance to do for others. "Good morning," she said. "My name is Mrs. Chandler. We are going to learn a great many things together. Some of them will be difficult. That is not a reason to stop. Are we ready?" 18 heads nodded. "Good," she said. Edmund Keller's health declined gradually through 1882, the way health sometimes declines on a man who has worked hard for a long time, not dramatically, but with a kind of slow, quiet subtraction. He had a chest ailment that Dr. Aldrich treated with what she had available and with the characteristic directness of a woman who believed patients were entitled to honest information. It was not immediately dangerous, she told him, but he would need to reduce his workload and take better care. Edmund's response to this recommendation was to reduce his workload approximately as much as he felt necessary, which was not as much as Dr. Aldrich felt necessary, because he was an Edmund Keller, and limiting was not something that came naturally. But he did accept, finally, Clayton's suggestion that the Chandler and Keller operations be formally combined under a shared management structure that would allow Edmund to step back from the daily labor while retaining full ownership of his portion of the stock. It was a practical arrangement that benefited both operations, and it also meant that Clayton was at the Keller homestead most mornings, which meant Edmund had company, which was what they both needed without either of them saying it directly. They would sit on the Keller porch in the evenings when the work was done, the two of them, and talk about the cattle and the territory and the way things were changing. The railroads pushing closer every year, the open range growing smaller, the great longhorn drives that had defined Texas for 2 decades beginning to give way to something different, smaller operations and more fences, and a different kind of ranching that required adaptation. Clayton adapted naturally, because adapting to what was real was how he operated. Edmund adapted slowly, and with the dignity of a man who had built his life on a particular way of doing things, and was not going to pretend the change was small, but who ultimately always chose the practical over the sentimental. Daniel came back from San Antonio in 1882 permanently, having decided that he preferred land law in practice to law in an office, and he set up as the county's attorney and also took over more of the Keller homestead's legal and administrative management, which freed Rebecca from one set of responsibilities even as her school continued to grow. Brother and sister found each other, as adults, with a great deal of pleasure. They had always been fond of each other, but the 12 years that separated their childhoods had kept them somewhat apart, and now they found they were genuinely compatible, which is the better thing. Daniel also fell in love, which he did with the same characteristic Keller directness as his sister, not gradually and with many false starts, but suddenly and completely when he encountered, at a county court session in the spring of 1883, a woman named Clara Holt, who was the Reverend's daughter, and had come to court that day to file a complaint about a fence encroachment with a determination and a legal clarity that impressed Daniel Keller to the point of paralysis for approximately 3 minutes before he recovered and introduced himself. Rebecca received this news with a warmth and a complete lack of surprise. "Of course," she said, when Daniel told her. "I've watched Clara Holt argue land rights at the general store for 2 years. She's the only person in this county who could manage you." Daniel did not disagree. Hattie Morse died in the spring of 1883 at the age of 83, in her own bed, with her boots off and her affairs in complete order, which was, Mabel Good said, entirely consistent with the woman she had been. Her passing left a specific gap in the town, the gap that the oldest and most honest people leave when they go, the gap of someone who remembers what things were before and is no longer there to say. Rebecca attended the funeral and stood at the grave in the Harlow Creek cemetery and thought about what Hattie had said at the general store in April of 1878, that the Keller girl was waiting for something real. She thought about what real had turned out to be and everything that had grown from it, and she thought that Hattie Morse, who had lived 83 years and buried 2 husbands and had opinions about everything and had been right about most of it, would have found the total tally satisfying. She mentioned this to Clayton on the way home, and he said, "She was a good person," in his usual direct way, and then, "She was right about you," and Rebecca leaned against his arm in the wagon seat and watched the hill country go by in the spring light. Henry Chandler turned 3 in April of 1883, and had by this point developed a personality so specifically composite of both parents that it was a source of ongoing entertainment to everyone who knew them. He had Clayton's patience and his dark eyes, and his habit of looking at things carefully before responding to them. He had Rebecca's absolute certainty about what he wanted, her directness, and her complete absence of social anxiety, which manifested in a 3-year-old as the willingness to walk up to anyone adult, child, horse, or occasionally a skeptical dog, and introduce himself with complete seriousness. He also had his grandfather Edmund's beard, which was a genetic impossibility at 3 years old, but Edmund maintained that the child had his beard in principle, and nobody contradicted him. Rebecca was expecting their second child by the summer of 1883, which she calculated would arrive in late January or early February of 1884, and she continued teaching through September and made arrangements for Maria Garza's eldest daughter Lucia, who was now 17 and had been helping in the school for a year, and was, as everyone had privately predicted, formidable to manage the classroom through the winter. She was characteristically matter-of-fact about all of this, and Clayton was characteristically attentive without being managing, and the balance of it was the same balance that had characterized their marriage from the beginning, two people of equal competence moving through their shared life in the specific harmony of people who have found exactly the right partner. Their second child arrived on a February morning in 1884 and was a daughter. They named her Charlotte, for Rebecca's mother, which Edmund received in the sitting room of the Walker Spring house with his hand over his eyes again, and the particular silence of a man who is doing arithmetic about time and love and what persists beyond the end of things. Charlotte Chandler arrived, as Henry had, with dark eyes and a considered expression, but where Henry had his father's patience, she appeared to have her grandmother's particular directness, a quality of focus in her gaze from the first days that made Dr. Aldrich say, with professional satisfaction, "That is a woman who knows what she wants," which Rebecca found both accurate and slightly alarming as a prediction for the next 20 years. Henry received his sister with the solemn interest of a child who has been prepared for a new responsibility and takes it seriously. He examined her with the careful thoroughness he applied to everything, and then announced that she was very small but that this would probably improve, which was the most accurate and the most Clayton-like thing that had ever been said in the room. The schoolhouse enrolled 22 students in the fall of 1884, and Rebecca returned to it in September with Charlotte 3 months old, and Lucia Garza confirmed as the full assistant teacher, a position that had been created officially and was paid from the county fund, which was a small but meaningful thing. The first paid teaching position held by a young woman of Mexican descent in Harlow Creek County. There had been resistance to this, as there was resistance to many things in that territory, and Rebecca had dealt with the resistance the way she dealt with all obstacles, directly, completely, and without apology. She had gone to the county board meeting and made her case with the ledger book clarity of a woman who had been managing complex arguments all her life, and she had looked at the 3 men on the board who were most uncertain and said, very clearly, "Lucia Garza is the best teacher I have access to, and these children deserve the best teacher I have access to. I would appreciate the board making its decision on that basis." The motion had passed, 2-1, and the one dissenter had eventually, by the following spring, come around to the position that results mattered more than his initial reservations, because Lucia's students could read and do arithmetic with a speed and competence that was difficult to argue with. Lucia herself received the position with the composed dignity of a person who is not surprised by recognition, but is aware of its significance. She came to Rebecca the day after the board meeting and said, in the quiet, specific way she had learned partly from the woman in front of her, "Thank you for what you did. Thank you for being worth doing it for," Rebecca said. Which is far more useful than gratitude. Edmund Keller's health stabilized through 1884 and 1885, which Dr. Aldrich attributed to the reduced workload and the regular company of his grandchildren, both of which she prescribed with equal firmness. He was still sharp and functional and had opinions about everything, which were delivered on the Keller porch to anyone who stopped by and to Clayton in particular, who listened to all of them with the respectful patience of a man who understood that an old man's opinions were also, frequently, 50 years of accumulated knowledge, and should be treated accordingly. In 1885, Clayton acquired another 40 acres adjacent to the Walker Spring land that the Cutler interest had once coveted and had finally, years later, come up for sale through a legitimate sale from a family moving further west. He filed on it with the same methodical attention to paperwork he had brought to everything from the beginning, and the combined property was now 220 acres of good grass and reliable water, running a herd of 60 head of quality stock that was the product of selective breeding decisions that Clayton had made carefully and patiently over 7 years. It was a respectable operation. It was growing. It was built on honest work and clear thinking, and the particular doubling of competence that happened when two capable people worked toward the same things. And it was theirs, not in the abstract, but in the specific, daily, lived sense of a life built together from the ground up. Rebecca looked at the accounts one evening in October of 1885. Henry 5 years old and Charlotte 18 months, both asleep in the next room. Clayton at the table across from her going over his own notes on the fall cattle figures. And she thought about the word prosperity, which her father had used when he came out from Tennessee with a wagon and a mule, and the conviction that the land would reward honest work. It had. Not easily. Not without loss. Not without the hard winters and the dry summers, and the practical arithmetic of survival that was the constant companion of frontier life. And not without injustice. She was honest enough with herself to know that the ground beneath their prosperity was not universally level, that the same territory that had allowed Clayton to file on good land and build something lasting on it had made the same path harder or impossible for others, and that Lucia Garza's teaching position, won after a board meeting argument, should not have required an argument at all. She thought about these things and held them alongside the gratitude, because she believed that gratitude without honesty was just comfort, and she had never been a woman who preferred comfortable over true. But tonight in the lamplight, with the hill country dark and still outside and her husband across the table and her children asleep in the next room, and the blue picture her mother had loved on the kitchen windowsill in exactly the right place, tonight she let herself feel the fullness of it without qualification. "Clayton," she said. He looked up. "Are you happy?" she asked. He looked at her across the table with those dark, steady eyes, the same eyes that had looked at her in the kitchen doorway in April of 1878, with a quiet and uncomplicated attention that had undone every defense she had ever built. He looked at her the way he had always looked at her from the beginning, as if she were the most interesting thing in the world and he had absolutely no plans to stop paying attention. "Yes," he said, one word, the most honest and complete answer available. She smiled at him across the ledger books. "Good," she said. "So am I." They sat like that for a while, in the warm lamplight of the house they had built, on the land they had chosen, in the life they had made together. Not without difficulty, not without the hard, daily work of two people choosing each other again every morning, but with a solidity and a depth and a specific, irreplaceable rightness that Rebecca Keller, who had turned down 11 men in a year and waited her entire young life for something real, had known. From the moment she first watched a man check his horse's leg in her father's yard without knowing she was watching, was worth every moment of the wait. The spring below the house ran cold and clear in the dark October night, the same way it had run through every winter and every dry summer, the way it had run through the drought of 1874, the way it would run long after all of them were done and gone, steady and faithful and entirely itself. Above the house, the Texas stars were extraordinary. They always were, out here. Edmund Keller came for Sunday dinner every week without exception until his last one, in the spring of 1888, and he always sat in the same chair at the kitchen table, and he always had the first biscuit and the best cup of coffee, and he always bounced Henry on one knee and Charlotte on the other, and told them about Tennessee, and about Charlotte's grandmother, and about a wagon and a mule, and the conviction that the land out west would reward a man who worked it honestly. He died in April of 1888, peacefully, in his own bed at the Keller homestead, with Rebecca beside him and Daniel on the other side, and the window open to the spring morning, and the sound of cattle in the yard that he had built from 200 acres and a mule and 37 years of stubborn, faithful work. He went the way he had done everything, directly and without fuss, and with an expression of complete peace on his face that suggested he had arrived somewhere he recognized. Rebecca grieved him the way she had always grieved, not quietly, because she was not a quiet griever, but with a wholeness and a fullness that honored what was lost by not pretending it was smaller than it was. She cried in the kitchen the morning after, completely and without apology, and Clayton put his arms around her and held her in the same steady, patient way he had always held everything that mattered to him. And he did not say that it would be all right, because he was not a man who said things that were not true, and right now it was not all right, and they both knew it, and the knowing of it together was the thing that made it bearable. They buried him beside Charlotte Keller in the Harlow Creek cemetery, under the Texas sky, and Reverend Holt said the right things in the right order, and Maria Garza brought food the next day, and Daniel handled the estate with the quiet efficiency of a man who has been a lawyer for 6 years, and who loves his sister enough to take the practical burden of grief from her where he can. That fall, Henry Chandler started at the Harlow Creek schoolhouse. He was 8 years old and had been reading since he was 5, and could do arithmetic in his head with a speed that his teacher Lucia Garza, who had by now been teaching for 6 years, and had forgotten more about classroom management than most people ever learned, found both genuinely impressive and occasionally inconvenient. Charlotte was 4 and would not start school for another year, but she had her mother's fierce conviction that things that were happening in the next room were things she should be a part of, and she spent a great deal of time standing in the schoolhouse doorway conducting an independent evaluation of the proceedings. The Chandler operation continued to grow through the late 1880s, adapting as the territory adapted more fences, different breeds, the gradual changes in the cattle market that Clayton had anticipated years before and positioned for with characteristic foresight. He hired 2 permanent hands in 1887, a young man named Ezra Webb and a former trail hand named George Salter, who was 40 and had been on the big drives, and had come looking for something more settled, and both of them became part of the everyday fabric of the Walker Spring place in the way that good people become part of the places where they do good work. Rebecca's school, by 1889, had 28 students and a waiting list, which was a problem that nobody in Harlow Creek had expected to have, and which required the county board, now more cooperative than it had been in 1884, partly because results are hard to argue with, and partly because 2 of the 3 original members had been replaced by men who had children currently enrolled, to fund an expansion of the schoolhouse by 2 additional rooms. Lucia Garza was made co-principal. This was Rebecca's term. She invented it, because the existing vocabulary for school administration did not have a word for what she wanted, which was Lucia's full authority over half the school with equal standing and equal pay. The board agreed. One member did not agree initially, and then changed his mind, which was becoming the standard arc of interactions with the Harlow Creek School Board. In 1890, Charlotte Chandler started school. She walked in on the first day and sat down in the front row and opened her slate with an expression of complete readiness that made Lucia Garza look at Rebecca and say, very quietly, "I see." "Yes," Rebecca said with equal quiet. "I'm sorry." "Don't be," Lucia said. "I am looking forward to it." Henry, at 10, was the oldest student in the school and was already beyond what the current curriculum offered. Daniel Keller, with his usual practical efficiency, began a kind of supplementary education for his nephew law and history and the wider world, conducted on Saturday mornings at the Keller homestead, which Daniel now ran with the help of the Vargas brothers' younger cousins, having inherited it from Edmund, along with the cattle and the accounts, and the particular stubborn sense of responsibility that was apparently a Keller family trait. Clayton watched all of this, his son's hunger for knowledge, his daughter's fierce readiness, his wife's ongoing project of opening the world for people who had not always been let into it, and felt a gratitude so complete and specific that it had no adequate name in the vocabulary available to him. He expressed it, in his way, not with words but with the daily, faithful practice of being exactly who he was in every interaction, the kind of husband and father and neighbor who showed up. Always fully, without theater or performance or any of the noise that people substituted for depth when depth was hard. Rebecca saw this in him every day, and every day she understood afresh why she had waited. In the summer of 1891, Rebecca was 37 years old, and she was standing in the schoolhouse she had built from a kitchen table and 8 students, and the conviction that every child in 3 counties deserved to learn to read, and she was looking at a room that had 28 students and 2 teachers and shelves full of books and a blackboard covered in someone's multiplication tables, and she was thinking about her mother. Charlotte Keller had raised her daughter to be exactly herself. She had done this deliberately and at some effort, in a territory that had not always made it easy, and she had done it because she believed that the world was better for having more people in it who were entirely themselves, rather than satisfactory approximations of what others required them to be. She had never met Clayton Chandler. She had never seen the Walker Spring land or the schoolhouse, or the 28 children, or the blue pitcher on the kitchen windowsill in exactly the right light. But Rebecca thought that she would have understood all of it, would have looked at it the way you look at something that has come out exactly as you hoped, and felt the deep, specific satisfaction of a thing done right. She locked the schoolhouse on a Friday afternoon in July and walked home to the Walker Spring place in the long summer light, through the live oaks that her mother had loved, past the spring that ran cold and faithful and clear. Clayton was at the fence line below the house, doing something practical with a fence post and a level, and the concentrated attention of a man who was going to get the thing exactly right or do it again. He saw her coming through the trees and stopped what he was doing and waited, in the patient, complete way he had always waited. She came up to him, and he looked at her, and she looked back at him, and between them in the summer light was 13 years of every morning and every difficulty and every triumph and every ordinary evening and every child and every grief and every ledger book and every fence post and every Thursday night around the kitchen table and every silence that had been more eloquent than other people's speeches. "Good day," he said. "Yes," she said. "Very." He put his arm around her and they walked back to the house together, and the spring was running below them, and the live oaks were making their cedar sound in the evening air, and the supper smell was coming from the kitchen where Henry and Charlotte were doing something that involved some noise and was probably fine. They went inside. The door closed behind them. The spring ran on in the dark below the house, the way it had always run, the way it would run long past all of this, faithful and cold and entirely itself. But what mattered was here, inside in the light, in the life they had built together on the good ground of who they each were, without performance or apology or any of the noise that the world sometimes required. Rebecca Keller had turned down 11 men in a single year and earned the bewilderment of 3 counties and been called particular and difficult and too choosy and more besides. And she had sat on her father's porch in the late afternoon light and waited for something that she could not name but could not settle without. Clayton Chandler had walked into her father's kitchen one Sunday evening in the spring of 1878 and taken off his hat and looked at her, just looked at her, plainly and completely, without announcement or strategy or the machinery of impression, and said her name, and then stopped talking. And that had been the beginning of everything. The stars came out over the Texas hill country, exactly as they always had, thick and extraordinary and entirely indifferent to the small warm lights in the houses below them. Inside the Walker Spring house, in the kitchen that faced east to catch the morning sun, the blue pitcher stood on the windowsill in exactly the right place. Everything was exactly as it should be. Everything had been, from the moment it began, exactly enough.